The Thing. There were two young boys named Trevor and Will. They spent most of their summer vacation hanging around town, looking for things to do. One hot August night, the boys were sitting on a fence by the main road. There was a cornfield just across the road. Suddenly, Trevor spotted something in the field. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out, but he thought it looked like some kind of weird animal. He nudged his friend and pointed in the direction of the strange-looking figure. Will said he could see it too. He wasn't sure, but mysterious things seemed vaguely human. The next thing they knew, the thing was gone. The boys craned their necks and scanned the field with their eyes. Out of the blackness came the thing. It slowly walked over to the edge of the field before disappearing again. No sooner had he said that Trevor felt a clammy hand on his shoulder. He turned around and found himself staring directly into the hideous face of the thing. He let out a yell of terror and surprise. The rotting skin on the thing's face was coming off in pieces, revealing the bone underneath. For a moment, it just stared silently at Trevor with its dark, sunken eyes. Then, it suddenly grabbed a hold of his arm. Trevor felt its fingernails dig into his flesh as he wiggled out of its grasp. The two boys leaped off the fence and ran down the road, screaming in horror. They didn't stop running until they reached their homes. They tried to tell their parents and friends about the thing that they had seen that night, but nobody believed them. When Trevor woke up the next morning, the scratches on his arm were still there. After a few days, they got worse and worse. Trevor got sick, and his parents took him to see a doctor. After examining his arm, the doctor told the boy it was infected and gave him some pills to take. Unfortunately, Trevor's condition got worse and worse. The infection spread to his entire arm, and it wasn't long before his flesh was rotting and falling off. He was taken to the hospital, but no matter what the doctors did, no treatment seemed to work. The infection spread throughout his whole body. Trevor was confined to bed and started to waste away. It seemed like he was beyond help, and as the days went by, he steadily grew worse and worse. His anguished parents could only sit at his bedside and cry as they watched their beloved son slowly rotting away before their eyes. On the day that Trevor finally passed away, Will came to the hospital to visit him. When the boy walked into the hospital room and saw Trevor lying in bed, he was horrified. His friend looked exactly like the thing. Scarecrow. There was an old farmer in Arizona who owned the best farm in the area. Everybody said his crops were the best, and people came from all over to buy their goods from him. Whenever people asked him how he was able to grow such good quality crops, the old farmer would say it was all down to his scarecrow. "That old scarecrow is the one I have to thank," said the farmer. "He makes sure no crows or critters or pests come near my crops." The old farmer had built the scarecrow himself, and it was a fearsome sight. He spent months working on it to make it as scary as possible. He knew how important it was to keep pests away from his crops, so he gave it enormous straw arms that stretched out about 6 feet and big long legs that made it as tall as a tree. But the scariest thing about the scarecrow was its head. The farmer carved it himself out of a huge pumpkin. He spent countless days and nights perfecting his design until it was perfect. The scarecrow's face and head was so grotesque and so ugly that even he was sometimes scared to look at it. But it was very effective, scaring away every rodent and bird that ventured near. The neighboring farm was owned by two young men who were brothers named Josh and Harold. They were lazy and never did much work around the farm, which resulted in their crops being bad. They were jealous of the old farmer's success and were plotting against him. If they could drive him out of business, they could take over his farm and make more money. So one night, the brothers decided to sneak onto the old farmer's land. They stole his prized scarecrow and brought it back to their own house, where they stuffed it into an old closet so nobody could ever find it. The next day, the farmer woke up to find his hideous scarecrow missing and all his crops being eaten by rats and crows. He fell to his knees and cried, knowing that his farm would soon be out of business. Meanwhile, the brothers, Josh and Harold, were watching from their own property and couldn't help laughing out loud when they saw the old man's tears of grief. Hearing the laughter, the old farmer came over and asked them if they knew what happened to his scarecrow. The brothers looked him right in the eye and said they had no idea where his precious scarecrow might be. "But I'll go out of business and have to sell my farm if I can't find my scarecrow," said the farmer. Josh just laughed in his face, saying, "That's your tough luck, isn't it?" "Sucks to be you," giggled Harold. The old farmer walked away slowly back to his house, his head hanging down in defeat and depression. That night, as Josh and Harold had trouble sleeping, not because they felt any remorse, but because they couldn't get the image of the scarecrow's horrible, twisted face out of their minds, they decided they would never be able to sleep as long as that ugly pumpkin head was in their house. So they got up and dragged the scarecrow out of the closet. Harold took a baseball bat and smashed the scarecrow's head to pieces until all that was left was little bits of pumpkin strewn around the floor. The brothers swept up the pumpkin head pieces and threw them in the trash. Then they went back to bed and were soon fast asleep, having put all thoughts of the disgusting scarecrow back out of their heads. Sometime after midnight, Josh and Harold were awoken by the sounds of scratching and clawing at their bedroom door. "Did you forget to put out the dog?" asked Harold sleepily. We don't have a dog," stammered Josh. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open, and a solitary long straw arm snaked in through the opening. Then a second arm thrashed around, followed by two long stick legs. The two brothers were frozen in fear, and could only look with horror as the headless scarecrow's body rose up on its long stick legs and its long arms, reaching out for them in the darkness. Harold felt a cold, sinewy straw claw close around his ankle and screamed as loud as he could. He begged his brother Josh to help him, but Josh was already running out of the bedroom. Fleeing in terror, he ran down the hallway, crashed through the front door, and out onto the moonlit road. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, puffing and panting, screaming at the top of his voice. As he passed his neighbor's house, he saw the old farmer standing at his gate. In the moonlight, he could see the farmer just staring at him with a strange smile on his face. Josh kept running, his bare feet slapping against the rough gravel road. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw something that scared him to his very soul. He saw the scarecrow running along the road close behind him. It was gaining on him, closer and closer. And that wasn't all he saw. He noticed that the scarecrow had a brand new head, and it looked a lot like Harold. Abigail. Many years ago, there was an 8-year-old girl named Abigail Townsend who lived in the Spooner House in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Her father was a fisherman and he was away at sea most of the time. Abigail never had a good relationship with her mother, but whenever her father left, things got much worse. Her mother became very abusive, and Abigail always feared her father leaving because she was afraid of what her mother might do. One day, Abigail's father failed to return from one of his fishing trips. Abigail's mother blamed the poor girl for her father's disappearance and took her anger out on the child. One night, poor Abigail died under mysterious circumstances. Her mother said that it was a bad tooth that killed her daughter. She claimed that Abigail's toothache turned into an abscess and the infection spread throughout the child's body, killing her. Many people refused to believe her story. They suspected that Abigail's mother had brutally murdered her own daughter, stabbing the little girl to death in a fit of rage. Ever since that time, the ghost of little Abigail has haunted one of the upstairs bedrooms in the Spooner House. Many people claim to have seen her ghostly figure peeking out of the top window and playing with the window shutters. The Spooner House is now a museum. In 2005, a group of workers were hired to do some renovations of the house. When they knocked on the door, it was opened by a little girl in an old-fashioned white dress. Later on, when the manager arrived, he was shocked to see the workmen already inside and asked who had let them in. They shrugged and said, "The little girl did." "What little girl?" asked the manager. They searched the entire house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of any little girl. The workmen were so spooked, they gathered their tools and quit on the spot. One woman, who used to live in the house next door, said she woke up one night to find Abigail standing at the foot of her bed. According to the legend, if you stand in the street in front of Abigail's house and say, "Abigail, come play," you will see the ghostly figure of the little girl standing in the upstairs window. The Handshake. In an old forgotten cemetery just north of Goldsboro, North Carolina, there is a headstone that is cracked in half and held together by a pair of rusty brackets. Engraved at the top, there is the strangely haunting image of a handshake. The name on the grave is George Dean's, and this is his story. Back in 1856, there was a 17-year-old girl named Rachel Vinson who thought she had found the man of her dreams. He was 8 years older than her, and his name was George Dean's. Rachel dreamed about the beautiful wedding they would have. She was head over heels in love, but unfortunately, George didn't feel the same way about her. He had a wandering eye, and soon he was cheating on her with a number of other girls. When she found out that he was being unfaithful, Rachel was devastated. However, she didn't want to lose him, so she told him how much she loved him, and said that she would still marry him if he stopped seeing other girls. George wasn't very sensitive, and he bluntly dumped her. Rachel's heart was broken, and she felt like she could never love again. She fell into a deep, dark spiral of sadness and depression. Within weeks, her uncontrollable grief made her sick. She came down with a fever, and her body grew weaker and weaker. She had lost the will to live. One day, she called George to her bedside and asked him to lean in close. Then she whispered in his ear, "I realize I can never have you in this world, but I shall claim you in the next." The next day, Rachel died. She was buried in the little graveyard, and George tried to put her out of his thoughts and go on about his life. Almost a year later, George Dean was wandering home from a Christmas party, tipsy with a drink. His route took him past the graveyard where Rachel was buried. As he walked, he saw a strange fog-like mist rising out of the cemetery. It came floating towards him over the headstones and gradually formed into the ghostly figure of a woman. George started shaking and staggered backwards as he recognized Rachel's face. He was so frightened that he was unable to run as the ghostly apparition came closer and closer. Suddenly, it reached out and grabbed his hand. Its touch was icy cold, colder than death. Then, in an instant, the apparition vanished. George was found wandering aimlessly down the road. He seemed to be in a daze, and his right hand hung limp by his side. It was frozen solid. From then on, he suffered from excruciating pain in the hand the ghost had touched. Within days, his hand began to wither and shrivel up. Eventually, it dangled uselessly at his side. George Deans never married and spent the rest of his life alone. When he died, he was buried in the same cemetery as Rachel Vinson. In his will, he had left instructions for that ghostly image to be chiseled on the tombstone above his name. 2 hands, eternally clasped in an ice-cold handshake. In 1897, a family named Otto lived in a nearby house in Key West. They owned a plantation and had a lot of servants working for them who they treated very badly. One servant girl gave their son, Gene, a present of a doll. What the Ottos didn't realize was that the servant girl knew voodoo and black magic. Gene's full name was Robert Eugene Otto. His parents had always called him Gene, so he decided to give the doll his real name, Robert. Many strange things began to occur in the Otto household. Neighbors claimed to see Robert moving about from window to window when the family was out. Gene began to blame Robert for mishaps that would occur. The Ottos claimed to hear the doll giggle and swore they caught glimpses of the doll running about the house. Gene began to have nightmares and scream out in the night. When his parents would enter the room, they would find furniture overturned, their child in a fright, and Robert at the foot of the bed with his glaring gaze. "Robert did it," Gene would cry. The doll was eventually put up in the attic, where he resided for many years. But Robert had other plans. Visitors that entered the house could hear something walking back and forth in the attic, and strange giggling sounds. Guests no longer wanted to visit the Otto home. Gene Otto died in 1972, and the house was sold to a new family. The story of Robert the doll had died down, but Robert waited patiently up in the attic to be discovered once again. The 10-year-old daughter of the new owners was quick to find Robert in the attic. It was not long before Robert unleashed his displeasure on the child, the little girl claiming that the doll tortured her and made her life a hell. Even after more than 30 years later, she steadfastly claims that the doll was alive and wanted to kill her. Robert, still dressed in his white sailor suit and clutching his stuffed lion, lives quite comfortably, though well guarded, at the Key West Martello Museum. Employees at the museum say that Robert is still up to his old tricks today. Robert the doll served as an inspiration for the doll Chucky,